Hello, everyone. Welcome to eLearnPOSH's webinar on all you need to know about PoSH compliance. We'll just give it 1 minute so that we can get started. So this webinar is to actually educate or build awareness about the PoSH law and the compliance requirements as required by the PoSH law. There are a few major points that every organization must consider while trying to comply with the PoSH law. And we'll start with basic definitions, and then we'll talk about 5 major points that every organization must implement when they are trying to comply with this law. Let me just move forward. First, it's about Sexual Harassment of Women at Workplace, Prevention, Prohibition, and Redressal Act 2013. This act came into existence back in 2013. It's based on Vishaka guidelines from the 1990s, right? So that's the foundation. After the Supreme Court laying down the Vishaka guidelines, the Parliament took this forward with an act that was enacted in the year 2013, right? Based on this act, an employer is defined as any organization which has, which is either government, non-government, partnership, even household. If you may employ a maid, even they are considered as an organization, right? So an employer is anyone who's responsible for management or supervision or control of the workplace. And it includes a person or board or committee members who are part of the organization, and anyone who's responsible for formulation or administration of policies. So if you consider this, any organization, it doesn't really matter whether it's a private limited company, public company, or a small partnership, even a household, everyone who controls the workplace, who's responsible for management or supervision, is considered as an employer, right? It's the employer's responsibility, as per this law, to provide a safe working environment for every employee at the workplace, right? So now the next definition is, who's an employee? A person employed at the workplace for any work on a regular or temporary basis, they're considered as employees. So it need not be just the regular employees who are on the rolls, but it could also be anyone who's on a daily wage basis, is also considered as an employee, right? And if someone is visiting, they would also be covered by the law, but it's just that they are not part of the employee list where the jurisdiction of the IC would be there, but they would also be covered in terms of handling grievances, right? So in terms, whether they are paid or not, it doesn't really matter as per the law. It's just that anyone who's employed in that place, even if you're an NGO and a non-profit organization where someone is coming as a volunteer, even they would be considered as employee. So the next one is aggrieved women. Who can be aggrieved as per this law? Any woman can be aggrieved. They need not be an employee of the organization. They would just be visiting the place as a customer, or someone who's coming there as a contractor, who's working as a part of a different organization, but for their work reasons, they just visited this organization. Any one of that kind would also be considered, as long as they are aggrieved women, right? So only women are considered as per this law for filing the complaints. So these complaints would be against any person. It doesn't really matter which gender they are. They would be considered as respondents. If a person complains against another person, then they would be considered as the respondent. Who would be handling the complaints against the respondent would be based on the jurisdiction, whether it's an organization which has an internal committee, or if it's against the employer, then it would be local committee. We'll cover some of these points as we go through, but these are the basic definitions that we need to understand before we understand the requirements of the law, right? So in terms of the compliance requirements, we would want to mention these 5 major points which are required for every organization to comply in terms of PoSH policy compliance. The first one is the PoSH policy, where there are certain requirements in terms of what needs to be done in terms of drafting a policy and how it should be disseminated. Then you need to have an IC constitution, which you need to constitute an internal committee, and that's the second requirement. Building awareness about the PoSH law and all of the policies and internal committee, that's the third requirement. IC, internal committees capacity building, that's the fourth requirement for every organization. And the last one is the annual reporting, right? So there are two separate reports that must be submitted by the organization. We will discuss about each one of these items, right? And I see that there is a question or someone has raised a hand. Okay, so you can post your questions in the Q&A panel. The session is getting recorded. So if there's any question that you have, you just post it on the Q&A panel and we would be handling them as we go through. Because there are a lot of points to be covered, we will not be able to open the microphone to handle questions, but you can post the questions on the Q&A panel. So let's talk about the policy. So every organization which has more than 10 employees should draft a sexual harassment policy or anti-sexual harassment policy, and the employer is responsible for formulating this policy. In terms of the requirements in this policy, the definitions of the different components in the policy must be in line with the law, right? And it should pronounce sexual harassment as a misbehavior or misconduct, right? It must be very clearly pronouncing that, and there must be zero tolerance for sexual harassment. And in case of consequences, in case of breach, what are the consequences? That must be clearly listed. And the committee structure, you must have an internal committee, which will be covered as we go through this session. The structure of the committee should also be clearly explained, right? In terms of complaints, how those complaints will be handled, how that would be proceeded, that procedure must be clearly explained in the policy, and the timelines and the process for inquiry should be there, and confidentiality should be clearly mentioned. These are certain requirements as per the law as well. In case the organization wishes, they can also have other elements, like for example, if in case you are part of an international organization and you would want to keep this as a gender neutral policy, or your organization has a culture where you don't differentiate between who's complaining, and you would still want to consider all sexual harassment to be considered for inquiry, then you can have a gender neutrality in the policy, right? Where there are certain provisions. Of course, the law doesn't allow you to have a gender neutral policy, but you can certainly have that, right? The second one is bystander intervention. While the Indian PoSH law doesn't allow bystander intervention, but there are certain states, for example, New York or California, they have certain mandatory provisions where bystander intervention is mandatory. You can also have that in your policy, but there are certain elements that you need to actually consider while you're considering bystander intervention. Bystander intervention is if someone is aggrieved, according to the PoSH law, only they can complain. Someone who observes that cannot complain about that that particular misbehavior. But in case of bystander intervention, even the person who's observing can protest and can even file a complaint. So now we need to really consider how to incorporate that in the PoSH law. So as per the PoSH law, you may not be able to handle that complaint from another person, but you can have your own grievance redressal procedure where bystander intervention can also be considered. But similar to gender neutrality, you need to have certain provisions of bystander intervention in the policy, right? And if in case you want to set up appeals within your organization, maybe an appellate authority within your organization to keep the complaints within your corporate structure, then you can have certain procedures related to that also provided in your policy. It need not be just about this. Of course, this will be slightly deviating from the PoSH law where there is a certain appeal procedure, but you can have that to make sure that the justice is served if in case someone still feels that their point of view was not clearly addressed. So you can have an appeals procedure as well. But all of this should be clearly drafted with the rationale so that people understand the purpose and the reasonableness of the policy. There is a question in the panel. Let me just take a look at that. Is the PoSH law different in academic settings as the complaints may come from students who are not employees? Of course, it is different. It is the same PoSH law, but in terms of the Saksham guidelines that are available, there is a separate procedure in terms of handling it. The structure of the internal committee is different. The way you handle the inquiry or the complaints are different. We also have a program for higher educational institutions. For schools and colleges, we have something based on POXO. So we also have programs from eLearnPOSH on those topics. But in short, yes, the law for PoSH is the same, even for higher educational institutions. But based on the UGC guidelines, that is the Saksham guidelines, the implementation of the law is slightly different. And if required, we can discuss more on that probably. If you have more questions, we can guide you. We have certain pieces of information on our website. You can go through that. And if required, we can actually discuss further, right? So right now, we will keep it generic for all organizations, but there are some minor deviations in terms of implementation of the law for educational institutions. Regarding bystander intervention, when we say the Indian PoSH do not allow, can we consider the complaint and still take action, just that it cannot be based on PoSH? That is correct. So we can still take action. It's based on your code of conduct. So I know this is coming sometime somewhere later in this part, where if your organization is based out of New York, as per their policy, you must, as per their law, you must have bystander intervention covered. But if an entity of that is in India, then you must have the PoSH policy based on the PoSH law as well, right? So to have a bridge, your PoSH law can state that the complaint as per the PoSH law will be handled only if it's coming from the aggrieved person, but any other person complaining on behalf of the aggrieved woman would be considered as per the code of conduct or some other workplace harassment policy or the grievance redressal mechanism that you have in your organization. But it is not as per the PoSH law. That must be very clearly mentioned. So the internal committee, even if it is the same committee that is inquiring into that, will not use all the powers of the internal committee provided by the PoSH law, and all the complaints that are handled will not be reported under the PoSH law. It is just your internal mechanism to prevent any kind of harassment, sexual harassment particularly, in the organization, irrespective of which gender or who's complaining. It doesn't really matter. So it's in spirit, it's a good thought. So you can have those provisions, but just that we should not use the powers of the PoSH law, because we will discuss that as we go through the session. There are certain powers with the internal committee, and that should not be misused. That's the whole idea. Okay, there is also another question. In case there is an appeal procedure in the organization, then complaint need not be filed with ICC. Actually, the first level of complaint will be filed with the internal committee. What I mentioned about the appeal procedure is beyond IC. If someone is not happy with the IC, of course, there is a jurisdictional way of going through the appeal. But within the organization, if you have anything in the policy which states that it would be heard again by another appellate authority, again, this will be slight deviation from the PoSH law, but if it is done in good spirit and if there is a good rationale for it, make sure that provision is mentioned so that there is another chance for the person to provide their view, right? So that can be done. There are several organizations which have also provided that, to make sure that it's not a Me Too kind of a situation where it goes on tweet or goes outside. To have that justice provided within the organization, you can have certain appeal procedures, and that can be done. For example, if you have a hub and spoke model of an organization, say a bank which has different branches across the country, and there is a centralized IC hub, and then there are spokes at different cities or states, you can also have internal committee there, and you can have certain appeal procedures there. So all of that, it would be good if you have all of this described in the PoSH law so that the employee is aware how it is handled in this organization. But the overall conditions of the PoSH Act would still apply, and the recommendations provided by the IC would still be applicable, but the organization should have an appeal process so that they can handle certain grievances within a short duration, right, within a reasonable amount of time. So I'll proceed with the content, and I'll come back to questions as we go through. Certain facts and myths. First one is global organization with HQ outside India, global policy will apply. So here, I know I discussed this briefly. While global policy can apply, the PoSH policy for India is required in line with the PoSH law, and that must definitely be applicable, irrespective of what other policies that you might have. In India, you need to have the minimum provisions of the PoSH law provided. Anything above and beyond that you provide with your global policy is absolutely fine as per your organization's procedure. but within India, the PoSH policy should be applied. So when we go through the next set of sessions, certain areas where there would be conflict with respect to these two items, we will discuss certain elements of that as well as we go through. But it's important to have the PoSH policy based on the PoSH law, and the minimum provisions recommended by the PoSH policy should be provided, right? Gender neutral policy is not possible. As we described earlier, gender neutral policy is definitely possible, but just that the complaints of the women would be handled as per the PoSH law, while complaints from the other genders would be handled by the grievance redressal mechanism of the organization. It's not as per the PoSH law, right? As I mentioned, even if the internal committee is the same grievance redressal committee, just that it would not be considered as a PoSH investigation. It would be considered as a misbehavior as per the code of conduct or any other workplace harassment policy that you might have. There are no women employees in the organization, so PoSH policy is not required. So this, again, PoSH compliance is not limited by the gender of the employees, but the count, right? So if you have more than 10 employees, you're supposed to have a PoSH policy. Whether they are women employees or not, it doesn't really matter. And the PoSH policy is required to protect anyone, if it's a contract employee or customers or visitors of the workplace, even they are to be protected. So you must have a policy and a committee if you have 10 employees to handle those complaints. So this is definitely required, right? So the next point, like how do you draft a PoSH policy, right? So you have, I'm sure a lot of methods would be used. For example, people would search on Google for policies, probably use Control-C and Control-V from other organizations' policy, that is copy and paste it from other organizations' policies. Various methods might be used. Some of the more professional methods would be to contact a legal person, an advocate who can help you draft the policy, or an expert in that domain who's well-versed with the PoSH policy drafting procedures. They can help you draft the policy, right? So you can use any of these methods. Our recommendation would be to use an expert, someone who's familiar with these procedures in PoSH. They should help you draft. And there are a lot of nuances within the policy that needs to be considered, like gender neutrality, your organizational culture, and how you look at any kind of misbehavior, the punishments, the service rules, everything has to be considered. So we recommend going for an expert in that domain to be able to draft this policy. So here, we're just going to briefly explain how you can, how eLearnPOSH can help you with drafting your policy, right? So what we have, eLearnPOSH portal. So what we have is a policy drafting tool. So with our new PoSH portal launch, so you have this option where you can manage your policies, where you can go to the policy drafting tool. You can create a new policy as you need. And so all our subscribed IC members will be able to get to this place where it's an automated bot-based tool where it will provide you certain questions. You need to just answer those questions. Based on your answers, similar to what a consultant would do, based on your answers, this tool would draft a policy as per the organization's culture, the requirements, the other policies around in this space, right? So, for example, here it's got questions about like whether you want a gender neutral policy for your organization. You'll have a lot of description about it here. And if I say, yes, we would like to have a gender neutral policy, then it would give you an alert that PoSH Act doesn't allow gender neutral policies. While you can still handle complaints, it would be handled using the grievance redressal mechanism in your organization, right? And it will also ask questions like whether you wish to have, whether you have multiple branches in your in India, and if you choose yes, you need to mention the number of branches and how your IC is structured, whether it's hub and spoke model or whether you have a single IC for the entire country. And it would also alert you, because as per the law, you're supposed to have ICs in every branch. So it will also give you recommendations on how it can be done within your organization, right? So this is the simple tool. At the end of it, it will give you a PDF document. You will also get an online place where you can edit, fine-tune the policy with the points that you wish to add, say, for example, other appeal process or anything that you might have. But all of this can be done using the drafting tool. And we still recommend having this vetted internally or through your legal counsel so that you go through, because it's still automated. You can still verify and make sure it's accurate, but it can give you a good policy based on the questions and the answers that you provide, right? So this is something that's provided by eLearnPOSH to our subscribers, IC subscribers, so that they can draft their own policy as they try to comply with PoSH law, right? So now, if there are any questions about policy drafting, I can try to handle that now. Okay, so can I have the PPT? So there's a question from one of the participants on whether they can have the PowerPoint presentation. We'll be sharing the recording of this presentation on after the session is over, so you can use that. The PowerPoint presentation at this point is not being shared. Any other questions that you have on the policy drafting? If you don't mind, if you can just put your questions in the Q&A panel, we'll be able to handle that. Who can be members of the policy? Okay, so the policy, the responsibility of drafting the policy is with the employer, not with the internal committee. But you can also form the committee and then ask them to draft the policy as well. That's also a practice some organizations would have, right? So it can be, it's still the responsibility of an employer, because they are the ones who have the authority to disseminate the policy, right? So the responsibility is with the employer, but you can authorize a person or a group to formulate the policy, right? Can there be one chairperson and there are multiple members in different cities in India? So I think this question, as we go through during the IC part, we will cover that, constitution of internal committee. While drafting the policy, will PoSH support an employee who's transgender by nature? Okay, so this part, yes, they would be supported as long as they identify themselves as women. So it's based on the gender identified by the individual, irrespective of which gender they are. So if they identify themselves as women, then they are covered by the PoSH law, right? So that's important. Gender identity, what they identify themselves as, that's important when you consider complaints from transgenders. All right, so there are certain questions. I'll just cover the 4 that we have. Can we have a policy skeletal? So you can get a lot of documents, policy skeletals that are available on the internet. What we have is a drafting tool based on your questions. We will be able to generate the policy for you. The tool will generate the policy and doesn't cost extra. Any subscriber would automatically get that. Any internal committee subscriber would be able to get that. Why policy document available only to IC members? Because they are the ones who will have the skill sets to be able to answer those questions and then proceed. We also provide it to the organizational administrators if they have IC member subscription, right? It's just a free add-on for anyone who's subscribed, but that's something that eLearnPOSH can provide, but policy can be drafted by anyone. Okay, is it required to display or mention that company has a PoSH policy? Yes, we will cover that part, like how to display and how to share with the organization. We will cover that as we go through. What are the requirements in terms of awareness? That will be covered as well. As soon as the organization have 10 employees, within what time PoSH policy needs to be drafted? So, so the requirement does not give you like timeline by which you need to actually draft the policy, but if you have 10 employees, you need to have that. So any reasonable time with justification should be fine in terms of having a policy drafted, right? Okay, so with that, I will stop the questions for this part of the session. Then we'll move on to the next topic, which is on internal committee constitution. So here, I'm going to pass the slides to Maya Srinivasan. She's a subject matter expert in eLearnPOSH. She's also a postgraduate in psychology, and she's developed a lot of our internal committee modules, and no better person than her to talk about internal committee constitution, right? So Maya, over to you.
Thank you, Santosh. Let me start with constitution of internal committee. In the meantime, if you have any questions, you may feel free to leave them in the Q&A panel. We will take it up while we go through the session. We'll ensure that we get almost all the answers covered before we wrap up the session. So let me begin with the constitution of internal committee. So as per the section 4 of the PoSH Act, section 4 of the PoSH Act mentions every employer of a workplace shall, by an order in writing, constitute a committee to be known as the Internal Complaints Committee. Later, there was an amendment that in which the term internal complaints committee was amended to internal committee. So now the used term is internal committee or IC. Okay, so next point is something related to a question we have received. So should an IC be constituted in every branch? So as per the law, where there are offices or administrative units which are located in different places or under divisional or subdivisional levels, the internal committee should be constituted in all these levels. So that means any branch, unit or a division that has 10 or more employees must have their own internal committee with exactly how the PoSH Act asks the internal committee to be constituted. So now let's take a look at how the internal committee will be, the composition of internal committee. So we will have a presiding officer who will be a senior woman employee from the company. So please note that it should be an employee and not an employer. So the presiding officer will be the chairperson. And then we will have 2 members who are employees from the organization who let's call them as internal members. And finally, we will have 1 member from a non-governmental organization or an association committed to the cause of women or a person familiar with the issues relating to sexual harassment. So it is ideal, or it is really good to have somebody who have very good legal knowledge and somebody who has worked around the PoSH Act and rules. Let's call this person external member, and the external member would be the one who would be providing legal advice to the whole internal committee. And finally, 1/2 of this internal committee should have women. So we should have minimum of 4 members in the internal committee, including the presiding officer, external member, and 2 employees. And out of these, at least 2 should be women. And okay, yeah. So looking at the tenure of the internal committee, all the members of the internal committee holds the office for a period of 3 years from the date they were nominated as the internal committee members. Soon after the 3-year period is over, the employer must reconstitute the internal committee with fresh people who have not been internal committee members before. That's what it's about, the internal committee members composition. Now let's take a quick look at the external member that we've talked about. So external member is somebody who would have no connection with no relationship with the organization other than being an external member. This is because external member plays a very, very important role in preventing and redressing sexual harassment complaints. So external member is somebody who will ensure that all the inquiry proceedings that happens that is conducted by the internal committee is neutral and objective, because that would be one person who is completely independent from the company or the organization and is not a subordinate to the employer. Hence, we suggest that employers must set very high standards when hiring an internal committee member. Make sure that they have good experience working with issues related to sexual harassment of women at the workplace, and somebody who has a good knowledge about the PoSH Act. It's also, you can always take help of the external member in creating awareness about the PoSH Act within the organization, drafting policy, when there's dilemma, when you're handling cases. So it's very, very important to have somebody that experienced when hiring an external member. So having said that, we have a service that eLearnPOSH provides, a service called External Member Directory that I would like to introduce to you all. So having said that, eLearnPOSH provides this free service where all the organizations can come and search for an external member from our external member directory. From the eLearnPOSH.com website, you can click external member directory, and this is where it would take you to. So if you are an organization, or if you're somebody from the organization who's looking for an external member, you can click here and start. There is no need to log in or register. It's a free service. If for an individual who is extending external member services, they can register to our portal and enter their profile and with all the details, so that organizations can come and search, and if they find the profile suitable, they can contact you via the website. So I'll just take you through the external member service. So as an organization, you can just click start here. And this is where it would take. Let's see, an organization from Mumbai is looking for an external member. So you can just go click top cities and search Mumbai. So here you will see a list of external members who have registered to our portal, and you will, if you click view profile, you get to see the details of their profile as well. And if you would like to contact them, you can click the contact icons here, and you will get contact details about them as well. And the whole conversation or the whole discussion would happen between the organization and the external member. And there is, other than providing the list to the organizations, eLearnPOSH does not have any other hand in this whole selection of the external member. So that's what's about external member. Let me continue with the topic we were having. Let's continue with the constitution and constitution of internal committee member. The next topic we have is disqualification of IC members. So as I said, IC members hold the position for a period of 3 years, but there are times that the IC members can be disqualified by the employer in case there are genuine and valid reasons. And we will look at those valid reasons right now. So for the first one is if an IC member contravenes provisions of section 16. So section 16 talks about making any information regarding the complaint, the identity of the witness, respondent, or the complainant, details of the inquiry, details of the conciliation, inquiry report, any of these details public. So it is so important to keep them confidential that in case an internal member breaches confidentiality, they can be disqualified by the employer. That's the first reason. Next one is if any of the internal committee members is convicted for an offense or an inquiry into an offense is pending, then also they should be disqualified. The next one, in case they are found guilty of any disciplinary proceedings or they're going through a disciplinary proceeding. And finally, if the external member has abused his position to continue in the position of being an external member, that's also one reason he or she can be disqualified from being an external member. So if an external member is disqualified from the position, there would be a vacancy that will be created, and the employer must fill this vacancy by a fresh nomination and always ensure that the internal committee has at least 4 members throughout. Now, I'll just quickly take you through some timelines for inquiry. So the internal committee is conducting an inquiry. We would have the inquiry to be completed within 90 days from the date of receipt of the complaint. And the internal committee should submit the report, that is the inquiry report, to the employer, to the complainant, and to the respondent within 10 days from completion of inquiry. And finally, the employer must act upon the recommendations by the internal committee in the inquiry report within 60 days. And another important feature that we will discuss later also in the webinar is the powers of civil code, that the powers similar to the civil code that the internal committee possesses. So while conducting inquiry, please note that these powers are applicable only when they're conducting the inquiry into a sexual harassment complaint filed by a woman. So while that's happening, the internal committee has the power to summon and enforce the attendance of any person and examine him or her on an oath and ask for any kind of documents or evidence that will be important for successful completion of the inquiry and any other matter which is important for the completion of the inquiry. And finally, if you remember that I've spoken about constituting the internal committee in writing. So I just have a quick template for you here. So for private limited companies, the order in writing means it should be done via board resolution. And if you would like to have a template for board resolution for formation of internal committee, we can help you with that. If you can visit our eLearnPOSH.com website and go to the section called blogs, you can just type board resolution in the search box and you would find the first document of the first blog that would appear. Yeah, so this Yeah, so this is a template. The blog contains a template that you can use for board resolution of internal committee. So here is a sample text, and you can enter the details of the presiding officer and the name and the designation of the presiding officer, the name and designation of the internal committee members and the external member, and these would be the powers and responsibilities of the internal committee. So this is an example. This is a template that you could use if, as a new organization, if you're trying to form an internal committee. Pretty much it from my side. So let's move on to QA. Let's see, we have a few questions. We have a question that says, is it required to display or mention that the company has a PoSH policy and IC members list? This is a topic that we can discuss later because we will be discussing topics related to this also later. Okay, see, we have a question where it's asked, as per section 2A of the PoSH Act, what if the organization does not find any woman employee anywhere in the organization or its units? How would IC be constituted? So it's a very tricky scenario. So what the PoSH Act says is, if the particular division or the branch does not have a senior woman employee, then we can have a senior woman employee from another division or branch. If that's also very tricky, then the only choice we are left with is to have the external member, to hire a suitable external member and have the external member as the presiding officer. This is not advisable, but this is the best case scenario we have here. Is it, we have a next question that's asked, is it necessary for an organization to have a formal contract with the external member?
So I think it's definitely a good to have situation as long as the order of constitution is in writing and there is an acceptance letter from the external member. I think that should be more than sufficient for you to appoint them as external member, right? But in terms of having a contract, I think that's like definitely a good to have situation where the organization has a contract. It's a professional practice to have that contract, but it is not mandatory as per the PoSH law. It is more of a contract between the organization and the external member. So what you need to have is an appointment that is provided and the acceptance from the other person that they have accepted the appointment. That should be sufficient for you to have anyone appointed as the external member.
We have another question that asks, is there any time limit within which the vacancy created in IC needs to be filled? So the PoSH Act does not clearly mention that a particular timeline within which the vacancy must be filled, but it's better to do it at the earliest after conducting a formal training for the internal committee or the new nomination, so that we or the organization does not have to go through a struggle in case they find or they receive another sexual harassment complaint. It's better to have an internal committee member before we find, or a properly formed internal committee member before the organization receives a sexual harassment complaint. Do we have any more questions related to internal committee? So, okay, so we don't have any more questions. I will pass it on to Santosh to continue with the webinar.
Thanks, Maya. So let me just share my, okay. So that's about the internal committee. So let me move on to the next one, which is on employee awareness. So this is a section where you need to build awareness amongst your employees about various elements, right? So one of the questions in the Q&A panel was also about awareness, like, is it important for us to disseminate the policy? So we're just going to break the whole thing in terms of how this awareness can be built amongst your employees. So the law requires the organization to build awareness on 3 elements. One, the policy itself, right? So you need to make sure the PoSH policy is disseminated to all the employees in a way where you have evidence of disseminating, and the employees also having acknowledged that this is the PoSH policy and I understand that. So some way you need to have that policy disseminated. Then you should also build awareness about the internal committee, because if you have a committee to handle complaints, and if there is no way for the employee to know who are the members in the committee or how I can reach them, then it's no point having such a committee. So it's important to also build awareness about the internal committee, the presence of one, and how they can contact them. The last part is sensitization. So this is more of a proactive one, because all this policy and internal committee is more like giving the message to be reactive once the complaint comes in. But sensitization is very important so that we can prevent such complaints or situations from arising where someone has to complain, right? So this is also very important to actually make sure the employees are aware what is the right procedure, what should be done, what should not be done, what can be considered as sexual harassment in an organization, in our organization, and what should I do in case some such things happen. Everything has to be disseminated to the employee, right? So how can you build awareness? One, training and awareness sessions. This is very important in terms of sensitization. It should be engaging sessions where people can come up with questions, get clarifications, or at least have a comprehensive program where they understand all their responsibilities, right? So it can be done in various ways. Classroom sessions where if you can have a session where an expert can actually talk about it, talk about the policy and the internal committee and the law itself, and what, as per the law, based on various judgments, how they can simplify it to the employee to make sure they understand. That's a good one to have. You can also go for the webinar version with people working remotely. And we can also look at e-learning programs, which can help this part of awareness being built, right? So in case of e-learning programs, as long as it's engaging and it's also comprehensive, employees would still get the awareness, and it's a lot more easier solution if you look at it from compliance tracking point of view, or making sure everyone is completing the trainings and all that. E-learning is much better because it has a lot of flexibility of saving the progress, coming back and continuing later when you want, generating reports, which is kind of difficult and manual when you do classroom sessions or webinar sessions, right? In terms of another requirement is, as per the law, is to display certain things in conspicuous locations. First one is the policy, because the law expects you to also share the policy and disseminate and make sure every employee is aware of that. So you need to display the policy in your cafeteria, on your intranet page, or any conspicuous location where they can actually easily reach out. Then the next one is posters, where you need to put up posters on two things. One, clearly listing the sexual harassment or act of sexual harassment as a misbehavior or misconduct, and also about the contact points for IC. This is something that's expected in terms of posters. You can also do that through mailers, emails, or you can have it on an intranet page. But these must be done where it's kind of clearly displaying that the organization is against sexual harassment, and these are the things that we've done to handle any issues of such nature, right? Then you need to also share the internal committee member contact points, as the law mandates that to be available in conspicuous locations. In some cases, the posters and all that, it's also in specific places like the cafeteria or any place where people would actually visit. So that's something that you need to provide. So you need to have some way to communicate this to the employee in terms of awareness, so they know where to go and complain. Some elements are like to prevent sexual harassment. Some elements are to react to a sexual harassment in a structured way through the internal committee process, right? That's important. You can also have these implemented as a part of the onboarding program. So you cover every employee and there's no one who's getting missed out. So they enter through the onboarding program. So you can have the employee training at the onboarding time. You can have that. And some organizations also have the process of having a declaration that's signed by the employee saying, I'll report if there's anything that's identified, or I would not involve myself in any of such activities. So that's something that you can do. But these are the major elements through which you can build awareness within your organizations. It could be through training and awareness, or displaying certain elements of the law itself, like the policy, posters and everything, and internal committee contact members, internal committee member contact points in conspicuous location, or having this part of the onboarding process. The end objective is the employee should not say that I didn't know that this is something that's considered as harassment, or I didn't know that there is some law like this, or I didn't know that there's some process like this, or this is considered as misbehavior, right? So having a policy and locking it safely inside your boardroom is not going to be sufficient. You need to also make sure everyone is aware of that, and everyone feels that it is a safe working environment for me to continue to work, right? So that's something that's very important, and that's what the law expects as well. So these are methods by which you can actually build awareness, right? So how eLearnPOSH helps with awareness, we just wanted to touch on that point pretty quick. Let me just Okay, so this is the eLearnPOSH portal for any employee who's subscribed to our, any organization who subscribed to our POSH subscriptions. For the employee, the page would look like this, where on the dashboard, you would have the course that's going to be provided for the employee. If you look at the course, it would be available in 7 different languages apart from English. In fact, eLearnPOSH is the only provider who provides this course in 7 different languages. We have it in English, Hindi, Marathi, Bengali, and all the 4 South Indian languages, Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, and Kannada, right? So this is something that's available as a part of the employee awareness program. And you also have the sexual harassment policy displayed right on the dashboard. So if the employee wants to know, or if he wants to be aware of what the policy is, they can download. You can either provide it as a PDF document or a link to intranet page, but it's just making sure that the employee finds it in a conspicuous location in the digital medium, right? So the internal committee members would also be listed with their contact points. Here we have certain examples of how it would be displayed. So they would know that, okay, I can reach out to this person so that I can get support if there is any sexual harassment incident that's happening there, right? And every employee, when they complete it, all of this is tracked. The HR department or the administrator of the organization would be able to generate reports. So you would know that the awareness is built and there is evidence of that awareness through in the form of scores, assessment, test scores, and there's also a certificate issued to the employee. And all of this is provided in a branded environment. Like here, you put a dummy logo, but this is something that would be with your environment, within your environment. So you'll have your logo and the whole branding of the site would be according to that, right? Including the color and everything, right? So that's one part. The next part is in terms of awareness through posters and mailers. We have a poster service where if in case your organization is subscribed to our services, you will be able to download posters. The administrator of the organization can download posters. This will be available again in other languages as well. Say, for example, you have posters here. You can download a JPG version if in case you want to put it on an intranet page or send it as a part of an email. You can also download a printable version through the PDF format where you'll be able to get a high resolution version of it. And again, in multiple languages. So if you go for, say, a version in Tamil, you would find that. So Tamil, Malayalam, or other languages are also available here. You can download a JPG version, or you can also download a PDF version. So once you go to view or click the image, you will be able to download that post. And once you open that, you will find that in a JPG format, right? So this is something that's available for our subscribers. These are methods by which we can actually build awareness amongst your employees. We provide it in the form of policy awareness, IC member contact points, sensitization through an e-learning, which is highly engaging and interactive. And we also have posters which will help you build that awareness, right? So I'll handle any question and answers that might be there. So I'm going back to a previous question, whether the PoSH policy and IC member list should be shared. Yes, we definitely recommend that because that's one of the things that we would we want to share when we have a policy and IC. It's important to also profess that and make sure everyone understands that you have such a structure in your organization. And so this is one way by which you can actually do that, right? And the other method is to also display it in conspicuous locations like your reception desk, or if you have a cafeteria, then you can have it there, or any meeting room where a lot of people gather, you can also have it there, right? What you have only 3 members instead of 4 in IC. So the law requires you to have 4 members because you need to have a presiding officer who's an employee and 2 other employees at the member level and 1 external member, right? So it is important to have 4 members as per the sections relevant to the constitution of internal committee. So if you have only 3 members, we would definitely recommend you having 4, as long as you can maintain 50% of them as women. Then as long as you can take care of that, we recommend you have 4 members. And also for any inquiry that you conduct, the presiding officer and the presiding officer must be present, and a minimum quorum of 3 must be there. So if in case someone leaves or someone is on leave, it's going to be a difficult situation for you to handle that. So You can also have male members in that internal committee if in case you have fewer female members, as long as you can maintain the presiding officer to be female and the external member to be female, then you will be able to have male members, right? The next one, is it okay if an external member is an old vendor, right? I think Maya was very clear that as much as possible, you should avoid any position of conflict. So we strongly stay by that. The single reason why we don't provide external member services as eLearnPOSH, while we have experts in that domain, is because we don't want to be in any situation where the organization has to go through an inquiry again because the court ruled that there was a conflict or bias, because we are providing other services. So we strongly recommend that you don't have any evidence of conflict. There are also case laws where the judge has mentioned that though the external member has previously provided legal services, the bias could not be eliminated completely. So that whole, I think it was Ruchika, someone's case, Ruchika Singh Chabra with Air France. So that's the case. Thanks, Maya. So that's the case where the judge ruled that the whole inquiry was quashed and they had to redo the whole inquiry again, right? So we strongly recommend that you don't have, there are several options. If not, in our directory, there are several providers, great quality providers. We have had the privilege of working with a lot of them through our process. So you can engage them through our process of evaluation in this domain. You can engage with them and identify an external member. There is no dearth or shortage of good quality external members. So you don't have to settle for anyone who might be considered as a conflicting situation or a biased person, right? Okay, there is another question. After IC members complete 3 years, what if the company do not have senior women employees? Can junior employees be considered as presiding officer? So the reason why, look at the spirit of the law in terms of why they want a senior person to be there, so that there is some level of authority in terms of decision making, in terms of maturity, in terms of handling such inquiries. So having a junior level employee would not be recommended. If there is no other way to have an external, have a presiding officer who's a senior employee, you may consider to appoint the same person, because as long as there is a reason and there is no other bias or comfort factor settling in, and this person is an eligible person otherwise, right, apart from just completing 3 years, if there is any way they can continue to be there, they are not a director on the board or anything like that, and if the documentation for that is completely done, like there is a justification provided, I don't think the court would rule out saying, okay, this is a wrong thing, because they would look at the reason behind it. Instead of having a junior person who cannot act against the respondents who might be senior to them, it's good to have a senior woman employee. So that's the take that I would have. And I've seen several situations where the same IC members are appointed again because there is no other eligible person to be there, and they are the senior most women employee in the organization. So you can continue to have the same person. There is nothing wrong in doing that, as long as you follow the due process in terms of board resolution and appointing them in terms of reconstitution. Everything is taken care of. I think this is totally fine. So there's another question. Sometimes where the companies are comfortable would propose to the PoSH professionals to be part of their IC committee. What is your views? Okay, so there is a clear judgment, same Ruchika Singh Chabra's judgment itself. It's important, the reason why the law or the parliament wanted an external member from an NGO, right, a non-profit organization, is because there should be no evidence of conflict, right? There is no evidence of bias. And if you read that judgment, the judgment is very clear to state that if there is any element of conflict, then the external member should not be considered for IC appointment. Instead of understanding that after the fact of inquiry and that going for an appeal with a high court or a Supreme Court, you might as well choose a good external member. As I said, there are several external members in the market, and you would find real good ones. If you just spend about 30 minutes, you'll be able to find at least 5 or 6 of them who are really good. We would recommend appointing someone who has no conflict. As I said, it's a good business, but eLearnPOSH doesn't participate in that because we don't want to be in a position of conflict because we provide e-learning services. It's important for you to also understand that it should not be someone who's comfortable with the employer, who's not under undue pressure from the employer to take decisions in terms of hiring or firing anyone whom the employer may like, right? So that's the reason why they don't want it. So we wouldn't recommend that you propose or professionals who are comfortable, who the employers are comfortable with the selected candidate. Where do we find the case laws from? Yeah, where do you find case laws for PoSH related? One place is we have the judgments. While it will not include all the judgments, whatever is relevant and critical ones, we update that in the eLearnPOSH judgments. Whenever there is a new judgment, we try to have that on our portal explained clearly in terms of what's the summary and everything. So you can find that there. And of course, most of the courts have these judgments online as well, just that searching and finding them might be slightly difficult. There are other portals as well which are providing a lot of these judgments, right? So what is the maximum period by when the complaint can be filed? So the law is very clear in terms of how soon you can file the complaint. So it would be within a period of 3 months from the incident. And if in case there are a series of incidents, it is 3 months from the last incident, right? So that's what the law states. While as an internal committee can extend that period for another period of 3 months, or even longer if in case there is a rationale, because it's done with the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law. So that's what you need to consider. If it is a serious complaint, and if it's something that if you don't take action, if it can repeat again, there is nothing wrong if the internal committee takes up that complaint and handles it again. And if you want to strictly abide by the law, you can handle it as per the code of conduct policy as well, because the spirit is to ensure that the complaints are handled and addressed, rather than sticking to just that 3-month deadline or 3-month extension that the IC can provide, right? So what if the complaint is against the IC member? So I think it was also covered. If there is any kind of conflict, then the IC member should recuse themselves, or they should get disqualified if they don't recuse on their own, if the complaint is against IC member. And it is clear that if the IC member is one of the respondents, then they would obviously recuse, and they would not be part of the inquiry as well, right? So the presiding officer should take a call and appoint a different quorum for inquiries. Okay, can they be judge in their own case? I think it's a follow-on to that same point. Can HR or be or act as a member of the committee? Absolutely, there is nothing stopping a HR from being part of the internal committee. There is no mention of which department can or cannot be an internal committee member. They must be an employee, as long as they are not an employer, and they are eligible in all ways without any conflict in terms of internal committee. They can be part of it. And it also helps if you have the same committee acting as a grievance redressal committee for other things. And if your law is provisioning all of that, it's good that HR be part of that committee. There is nothing stopping from a legal counsel to also be part of that committee, and there is nothing stopping from an operations person or a director in the operations to be part of the committee as well. So anyone can be, as long as they are not an employer, and employer in the sense they're not a director on board or anything like that, they can be part of the committee, right? So where to appeal if dissatisfied? So that's what there are jurisdictional bodies which are available based on the organization type that you are, and for industrial disputes there are certain bodies that are available, and for if you're part of an organization like RBI, which is constituted, then there are some dispute mechanisms that can be handled. It's based on the organization that you have. And there are also recent judgments where the Maharashtra government had to appoint a body which can handle the appeals from the IC, and they did that as well. So the jurisdictional court would be handling that. And the second appeal would obviously go to the High Court, right? If an IC member resign any time limit within which IC needs to be filled, I think this was handled. So as soon as possible you do that, it would be good. And our recommendation would be to have a board resolution done in such a way that there is a person who's authorized to take such decisions immediately. So says someone at a senior level of the organization, not the IC itself, but someone else who can actually take care of further appointments or removal in case there is any emergency situation. Because the law, as you will see as we go through, there's a tight timeline in terms of inquiry, how to handle, and how soon you should actually send a notice to the respondent once you receive the complaint and all that. So it's important that you adhere to that timeline. And if you have to adhere, you can't have a board meeting to be required for every appointment if in case you're running short of the quorum. So it's important to have the board resolution structured in a way where you can appoint someone, say a vice president of HR, or someone who's a authorized personnel, or one of the directors who's authorized to issue an order in writing to reconstitute the internal committee, or appoint or remove additional members to the internal committee. That's something that we would recommend as well. And does the ICC at academic institution require more than four members with representation from students as well as along with employees? Yes, it is required as per the law, and students should also be part of that. And there are some judgments as well which are clear in terms of if you don't have the required students part of that committee, or if the dean appoints the IC members and all of that, there are conflicts of interest. So you need to be careful. There are some judgments. We have a nice course on higher educational institutions as well. That's going to be providing that. So there must be 3 students with at least 1 girl student should be part of the committee of pre-final or final year at the undergraduate diploma level. That's what is the requirement as per the HEI, that is higher educational institutions suction guidelines. So you need to appoint as per that. If aggrieved female employee is not satisfied with the final judgment of the IC, can she challenge them again? Yes, if there is an appellate authority within the organization, if the appeal process is defined, then she can challenge. She can also see for the aggrieved, I think this law and other laws provide a lot of options in terms of how they can actually go forward in terms of their appeal. It need not be just with the IC. They can also go to the police to file the case and proceed in that direction. But generally, if there is a workplace related harassment, then they would recommend going to the IC. The police would also recommend that, right? So otherwise, she can definitely appeal. If the person is not satisfied, not just the female, both parties can actually appeal. Okay, maybe for the benefit of participants, can you share the judgment of Ruchika, please? Yes, the next speaker would actually, Jilani, who would be sharing that information as we get to that point, right? So I think I'll just leave that question as is so that we handle that as we go through. Can the inquiry committee hire consultants like IT experts if required, as there can be complaints related to cyber stalking, cyberbullying? Absolutely, there is nothing wrong in hiring consultants if in case it's required. So the powers of the civil code includes all of the summoning and demanding evidence and all of that. It's available for the IC at all times. And if it's not provided by the people who are responsible or who are not, people are not able to handle that, they can definitely hire consultants. And of course, it must be with the consent of the employer, because they need to provide that support. And I think most employers, by their responsibilities described in the law, are also required to provide all the support required for the internal committee to conduct a inquiry, right? So I think there is nothing wrong in doing that. And in fact, that if in case the IC is not the expert in that field, it's important that they get the right person to help them in conducting the inquiry. How important is it to implement the PoSH policy in a company if it's completely on work from home culture, right? So it's a law of the land. So if the company is registered in India and has more than 10 employees, it is mandatory. It's not about how important, it's mandatory to implement the PoSH policy and all the awareness and all of the other stuff. In a work from home culture, there are several ways where PoSH can actually affect the work culture, where through late night calling or where forcing someone to come on a video call, or dressing inappropriately, or putting up posters on your background or on your T-shirt. These are situations that we've seen, right? There are several scenarios where organizations have had more cases when people are working from home, because psychologically as well, you would have a situation where you would want to have such experiences where you try to kind of harass another person to satisfy the need where you're not getting it socially when you meet other people, right? So it's important to have a strong policy and educate them to stop sexual harassment even when they are working from home, because workplace, by definition, is not just the place where you go to work, it's also the place arising out of work. So when you're working from home, even that is considered as workplace as per the law, and there are sufficient reasons to believe that it must be implemented without any difference, even when they are working from home. There are several ways digitally to implement that. E-learning is just one of the ways, but you can have webinars, you can have a policy that can be sent on an email or on your intranet portal and all that. So you can definitely implement that. What if one of the complainant or accused left the organization? Can they still complain or called for an inquiry? Right. So yes, absolutely. So if the complaint was filed with the organization when both parties are filed by an employee who was with the organization, or the employee who's left and within the 90-day period and all that, they can still file a complaint. And if the accused is still within your jurisdiction, the IC can actually act on that, right? The IC can act on the complaint and take action as per the service rules. If the person is outside your organization and there is no jurisdiction of the IC, because even if you want to fire that guy, you don't have the right to actually go and fire from a different organization. In that case, there are ways where you can report to the other organization, which may say that it happened before the employee joining my organization. So you can also go to the law enforcement, the police, to complain. So there are methods by which you can make sure the right jurisdictional authority is handling such inquiries. But anyone can complain because if it happened at a place related to workplace, then they can definitely complain to the IC, and the IC has to facilitate forwarding the complaint to the right authority. Right? Can company legal personnel be part of the IC as a member? As I said, there is nothing stopping any department or employee from being part of the internal committee. It's just that they should not be an employer and they should be an employee, right? And as long as you meet all the other guidelines of the law, then that should be good to go. Right? Can HR become PoSH trainer? Let us know, or furnish the certified training programs piece. So, so for a PoSH trainer, there is nothing like a certified training program. There is an empanelment by the Ministry of Women and Child Development for empaneled institutes which can conduct training programs. Anyone else offering a certificate to make you a PoSH trainer or PoSH certified IC member can only be issuing a completion certificate of a training program. Like eLearnPOSH would also be providing only a completion certificate. Even an empaneled institute would only be able to provide a completion certificate. They cannot empower you with the right, like you can be a certified trainer. So there is no program like that is available. You can complete courses, build the knowledge. Skill would be based on how you implement it. If a lawyer is an IC member, I presume, and complainant is dissatisfied with the management decision, can the same lawyer takes, there is nothing stopping from anyone, any complainant taking it outside to the court as well. So for this question, if the lawyer is an external member and the complainant is dissatisfied with the management decision, can the same lawyer take the case externally in appeal? They can take it up, but ideally, if you look at the situation, they should recuse themselves because they had inquired the same complaint as an internal committee member, right? So the complainant can take it to the court, but ideally the lawyer would not continue as per their own bar counsel recommendations. They would not take up a case where they were also a judge at some point as an internal committee member. So I think that's for the lawyer to decide based on their rules and regulations. Ideally, they wouldn't. Can the company's legal personnel be? I think that I've already answered that. They can be part of IC. What can be the punishment if found guilty? And So that will be as per the service rules of the organization. It can range anywhere. The law also clearly states from a warning or even termination or some services that they need to offer, community services that they need to offer. Everything can be provided as per the punishment. The law is very clear in terms of the options, and it's also dependent based on the service rules of the organization, right? Is there a penalty if we are late to implement the PoSH policy? Yes. So if you're not compliant with the PoSH policy, and if you're found not compliant with the PoSH policy, can be the penalty for the first time can be PoSH Law. The penalty can be 50,000 rupees, and repeat would be 1 lakh. But there are also other judgments that are applicable, which will be covered as we go through, where there are judgments where the penalty has been 1.65 crores and all that. So it's based on how you have implemented that law. But there is a penalty that's of course applicable, right? In terms of how well it is implemented, unless you're found guilty, you're innocent. So unless there is a case or anything that is against your organization, right now the mechanism is not strong, at least not strong in all the states. There are some states like Telangana and Maharashtra where there are ways they track that a lot more vigilantly, but otherwise it's more based on compliance, so that you prevent a situation if in case you're caught, you don't have this as a reason for a higher penalty. So that's what I would say. Okay, so I think we are running short of time, so I will move on to the next topic. We'll definitely come back and answer all questions. We just want to make sure we cover the topics before time. So the next topic is on IC capacity building. So I would pass it on to Jilani Khan. I'm sure if you've attended eLearnPOSH webinars, you must be very familiar with Jilani. He's a subject matter expert in compliance. He's also the co-founder of Succeed Technologies, and Succeed Technologies is the creator of eLearnPOSH.com, right? So I'll transfer the call to Jilani. Jilani, over to you.
Thank you so much, Santosh, and very good evening, everyone. So if you're able to hear me fine, can you please give me a show of hands? Right, perfect. So before I begin with my presentation, I just wanted to address a couple of questions that came by. One was regarding the judgment of Ruchika Singh Chabra with Air France. So I would want to share that. So this is the the synopsis of the judgment. So we can share this later, and this eventually will get added to our judgments page in our website. So the complainant, in this case, Ms. Ruchika Singh Chabra, she complained that the external member was not from any non-governmental organization and was not familiar with the issue of sexual harassment. The complainant was not informed about the qualifications of the external member, and the complainant got to know about it much later. And in fact, the external member was the secretary of the Employers Association in Delhi. And the complainant wanted to know if the organization was affiliated with the Employers Association. So you can clearly see that there is a very big element that can lead to conflict of interest, right? And the complainant alleged that the proceedings of the IC when they conducted the inquiry was not according to the PoSH Act. For example, the complainant alleged that the proceedings took place at the office of the employer instead of a neutral venue. And this is in contrary to the guidelines laid down by the Vishaka judgment, a landmark judgment, which actually led to the formation of PoSH Act. The complainant also alleged that she was denied the right to have her mother attend the inquiry proceedings because the PoSH Act explicitly mentions that the aggrieved woman can be accompanied by a family friend or a social worker or a psychiatrist, right? So she was denied that. And the complainant alleged that the inquiry itself was completely in violation of the principles of natural justice. We are going to talk about these principles of natural justice in a moment. So this is a very key element. And the Honorable High Court of Delhi, they made very clear and they stated that the deciding authority must be impartial and without bias. So this has been repeated throughout this webinar. So there cannot be any element of conflict of interest or bias in the formation of the internal committee or during the inquiry. Right, and the honorable judgment also mentioned that it's imperative that the woman who is alleging sexual harassment feels safe during the course of the proceedings and has faith that the proceedings are unbiased and fair. And you can clearly see that the the Honorable High Court clearly mentioned that the entire inquiry should be as per the principles of natural justice. You can see that the committee appears to have not conducted the proceedings according to the principles of natural justice. And they also questioned the formation of the internal committee here as well. And this is where the entire case was taken into account, and the judgment came in favor of the complainant, right? And there was one question regarding the penalty for the non-compliance of PoSH Act. So if you go to our website, you have this tab called the resources. Under the resources, you have this PoSH Act. If you go to PoSH Act, you have all the information that you may want to know about PoSH Act. And if you go to what constitutes non-compliance of PoSH Act, you have that. And under that, you have penalty, right? So the law stipulates 50,000, but we have had instances where companies were fined like 25 lakhs. And we have this reference here in this judgment on 16 September 2019, the company was fined 25 lakhs for failing to redress the complaint of sexual harassment. There was another judgment where the Honorable Madras High Court directed a company in Chennai to pay an amount of 1.68 crores as damage to an aggrieved woman. So you can see the reference. You can just Google these judgments to find more information about it. So with that, I think I would want to come back to our presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A section. We will handle them at the end of the webinar. Right. To begin with, I just want to start with a poll. Do you think capacity building of IC members is mandatory according to PoSH Act? What do you think? Do you think it's mandatory to enable the IC members, or is it optional? What do you think? I'll give a few seconds. Please take time to participate in the poll. Okay, the majority of them feel that yes, the PoSH Act makes it mandatory to build capacity for the IC members, while 5% feel that no, it is not mandatory. The answer is yes, the PoSH Act does make it mandatory to build capacity for the IC members. In fact, Section 19C of the PoSH Act states that every employer shall organize workshop and awareness programs at regular intervals for sensitizing the employees with the provisions of the Act, and orientation programs for the members of the internal committee in the manner as may be prescribed. So it's very, very important that there is enough attempt made to build capacity and to enable and empower the IC members. So now comes to the very big question. So why would PoSH Act go out of the way to make enablement of IC members mandatory? So to make it easy, I'm going to split it into 4 topics. Number 1, the powers of the civil court. As you are aware already that the internal committee, they have been vested with the powers of the civil court when they conduct an inquiry on sexual harassment. Number 2 is the concept of principles of natural justice, because the entire PoSH Act is based on principles of natural justice. And number 3, handling tricky scenarios. And number 4, the challenges posed in the new normal. So we're going to discuss each of these points in detail as we go along. Number 1 is the powers of the civil court. As you are aware that the internal committee does have the powers of civil court when they conduct inquiry into sexual harassment. And you need to understand that this issue is very sensitive. The moment a person is alleged or there's an allegation against a person about sexual harassment, it becomes very sensitive and is looked down upon. People go through a lot of mental trauma and agony. So it's not like handling any other case. So it's very important that the IC members are appropriately enabled and empowered to handle these cases with care. So when the IC members do not exercise their powers correctly, it can lead to severe consequences. Now, you might be wondering, what do you mean by severe consequences? What worse can happen? So I'm going to ask you, this time for another poll. Have you heard about a case of suicide of an MNC employee who was accused of sexual harassment? Have you heard about this case? It was all over in the news a couple of years ago. It was in 2018. Right, around 40% of the people say, yes, I have heard about it. And around 60% say, no, they have not heard about it. Yeah, so it happened in 2018. when a senior manager of a big MNC, he was alleged by 2 women employees of sexual harassment. So the internal committee, they suspended the employee pending inquiry. So the respondent in this case, who was accused of sexual harassment, he committed suicide, and he wrote a long note, and he wrote to his wife stating that, I'm innocent, but they suspended me without conducting complete inquiry. And now everybody got to know, and it's very difficult for me to come out of it, so I'm committing suicide. So that this is a very, very, very serious thing, because as per the Indian Penal Code, this would come under abetment to suicide. And the person's wife actually went to the court, lodged a police complaint and went to the court stating that it's because the case was not handled properly. It has led to the death of my husband. As you can see that it's kind of very serious. We are playing with the lives and careers of people. So it's very, very important that the IC members are properly enabled. Number 2 is the principles of natural justice. And we did see in the judgment of Ms. Ruchika Singh Chabra, the honorable judges, they explicitly mentioned that the inquiry conducted by the IC did not follow the principles of natural justice. As per Rule 4 of the PoSH Act, under the section manner of inquiry into complainant, it says, the complaints committee shall make inquiry into the complaint in accordance with the principles of natural justice. So this is very important. And there is one condition in principles of natural justice, which is called as audi alteram partem. It means listen to the other side, or let the other side be heard as well. So this will ensure that there is a fair inquiry, because you are letting the opponent, the respondent in this case, who is accused of sexual harassment, you're giving him a chance to explain his side. This is very important. Unfortunately, in the suicide case that we just discussed, this was not done. The person was immediately suspended. So there are several other things in principles of natural justice. Since there is a lot of emphasis on following principles of natural justice when conducting an inquiry, it's very, very important that the internal committee members are adequately trained on all the aspects of principles of natural justice. Next is handling a tricky scenario. As such, sexual harassment cases are very sensitive and very tricky. Let me give a few examples. There can be lack of evidence, especially in a workplace. It's very difficult to gather evidence. Let's say there is a lady who complains about an obscene behavior by her manager during one-on-one interactions. So how on earth can we gather evidence? So if you're going to strictly base our entire inquiry on concrete evidence, then it might be extremely difficult. So how do we handle this case? So it becomes very tricky, right? An understanding of jurisdiction. To give some examples, let's say the team in your organization, they go out for a team lunch or a team dinner. A customer at the restaurant harasses one of the female employees of your organization. So the employee now files a complaint with your internal committee. What does the internal committee do? If the respondent was an employee, then it's very easy, straightforward case. But here the customer is a stranger, right? He's not an employee of the organization. So what should the internal committee do? It again becomes very tricky, right? And let's say there is a wedding party. There is a wedding of an employee, and all the team members in your organization, they attend the wedding party. So there, a lady employee gets harassed by another colleague, a male colleague. But this is not part of the workplace, right? Strictly speaking, it's not an office store. It's a wedding party that was organized in personal capacity, where all the employees in the organization participated. So there is some harassment that takes place. So what should the internal committee do? So is it within their jurisdiction or is it outside their jurisdiction? Again, very tricky. Next is consensual relationship that turns sour. There are 2 employees who are in a consensual relationship and they break up. Then the lady later alleges sexual harassment against her former boyfriend. So what happens here? Will this fall under the jurisdiction of the internal committee? Will the internal committee have a say here? Can they comment on the consensual relationship? There are several questions that arise. And sexual connotations and harassment. There's a very thin line between where the behavior can be given a sexual color and where it cannot be given a sexual color. Most of the times what happens is the employees, they mix these two. To give an example, there is a manager who constantly keeps shouting at his female employees. So it's kind of common for the female employees to allege that the person sexually harassed me. So will this be sexual harassment? Of course, it is hostile work environment, but will this be sexual harassment? So that's a question that is there before the internal committee, and what should they do with it? So these are some of the tricky scenarios, and there are several. If you think about it, there are several that you can come up with. And so all these things lead to a common conclusion that it's very, very important that the internal committee members are sensitized to different situations that they can come across. So they are put in a good state to handle all these situations with ease and handle the inquiry according to the principles of natural justice. The last but not the least, as you know, that the pandemic had wreaked havoc, and most of us are working from home. And considering that every day we hear news about the third wave, right? It's very scary, and it may not be for another year that many of us will come back and work from office for long. So this has posed a lot of new challenges. So there was one question where the questioner asked, the entire company is working from home, so will PoSH policy apply? The PoSH Act clearly states, when it defines workplace, that any location which is associated as a part of your employment will be considered workplace. For example, if you're traveling in an office cab, it is because of your employment you are traveling in the office cab, so the office cab becomes a workplace. Similarly, when you're working from home, you are working, of course, it's your private place, it's your home, but you're working, so that, and the association is because of your employment, right? You use home to do your work. So the home now becomes workplace. So you can clearly see that PoSH Act definitely applies for all situations, even if all the employees are working from home. And in the statistics say that there is a lot of increase in cases of virtual harassment, as Santosh was mentioning, calling a female employee at odd hours, forcing them to come on a video call, wearing inappropriate attire, having obscene posters on the wall, so on and so forth. So there are a lot of challenges here. So there are cases of sexual harassment through virtual medium that are registered now. So how should the internal committee conduct inquiries? So how can they gather evidence? Because now it's all digital, right? So there are no CCTV cameras here, or there are not the other things. There are no eyewitnesses. So it's all digital evidence. So how do they gather evidence? Now, since it's all digital evidence, how are you going to maintain confidentiality? Because that's again a very, very important thing when they conduct an inquiry. Right? How do you prepare an inquiry report for an inquiry that was conducted for a virtual harassment? So these are tons of questions that an internal committee would have when they're dealing with a scenario like this. So this again leads us to the same point where it's very important that the internal committee members are empowered adequately to handle these scenarios. So now we can look at the different ways of IC capacity building. So of course, people used to do this awareness workshops. Mostly, it might be a 2-day workshop where the internal committee members are gathered into a classroom or a training room, and there's a PoSH expert who comes and delivers the awareness workshop. Nowadays, because most of the teams are working from home, are working remotely, so the webinars have replaced the traditional workshops. And last but not the least, the IC members can also be enabled through e-learning. The question is, how does eLearnPOSH help with IC capacity building? So eLearnPOSH takes a hybrid approach. So we offer e-learning to empower IC members, and we also add a webinar. So why e-learning? Because it gives you a lot of flexibility. You can take it when you have time. So for example, it may so happen that one of the IC members may go on an emergency leave. So if you were to ask them to attend a webinar or a workshop, they may not be able to attend. So what happens to them, right? But with e-learning, they can take it when they have time. So they need not go through it at once. They can take it little by little, because this is again very important, because when you the one thing that can happen during the workshops is the information overload, considering that there is a lot of legality involved in this entire thing, and making them sit through 2 days of workshop with so much of information download, right? It may not be, it may not really help with the knowledge retention. But when it comes to e-learning, they can consume it little by little, and which will help them go back and revisit whenever they want, and will help in better knowledge retention. Another thing is the IC members churn, right? One of the IC members might quit the organization, they might go on a long leave, or there might be a conflict of interest where they have to recluse themselves. So there can be several scenarios. So when you add a new IC members, what happens? Right, when it comes to the traditional way of empowering, be it workshops or be it standard webinars, there might always be an issue with enabling them. You cannot conduct a workshop only for one IC member. It's not feasible, and it's not cost effective as well. With e-learning, you just take the subscription and you can enable them. All you have to do is enroll the course to that new IC member, and they are set. So it gives you this lot of this flexibility, and definitely very, very, very cost effective. Now, there might be some people who will say, you know what, yeah, of course, e-learning will have its own merits, but it will always help when we have some human interaction. And we definitely understand that. And that's exactly why we have webinars as well. So we conduct periodic webinars for IC members. So the topics are selected by the subscribers, the subscribers of our internal committee courses. So we give a list of topics and we send them out for vote. And based on the topic that receives the maximum vote, we go with the selection of the subscribers. And all the webinars are conducted by PoSH experts. And we have an open Q&A. So every webinar has got an open Q&A. As you can see that you already have tons of questions. So imagine when you are getting into a topic like a tricky scenario or principles of natural justice, you can imagine the number of questions that would come. So all the questions that they have are answered during these webinars by the PoSH experts. So I'm going to quickly take you through the different topics that we have in our e-learning for webinars. So one is the structure of internal committee and the removal of the internal committee members. How should internal committee members handle complaints? What is the jurisdiction of internal committee? We spoke about it, right? So where can they get involved, where they should not get involved, where should they aid or assist the complainant in filing a police complaint, so on and so forth. Everything is covered in that. And the sexual connotation, harassment and discrimination, like I said, there is a very thin line between sexual harassment and where behavior can be considered just a hostile behavior. So everything is, all the different scenarios are covered in this course. What is the inquiry process? What should they do? What kind of procedures they should follow? So everything is covered in this. So what can internal committee members do to create an harassment-free workplace? Because that's one of the important things that PoSH Act mentions, right? It's not about handling inquiries, it's also about preventing such harassment from happening. So what can they do? So that is covered in this course. And annual report filing, which obviously is one of the PoSH compliance requirements, which will be discussed in detail in the next session by Santosh. And last but not the least, every module will have their own assessment. The highlight of all these modules is that they are very engaging. So they use rich animation and they give real life scenarios as examples. So, you'll be taken through virtual scenarios and, you'll be made to think through it and give answers. So I want to take you through some of the webinars that we conducted in the last couple of years. PoSH experts are invited as speakers. In November 2020, we had Dr. Sania Talwar, Advocate Sania Talwar, who conducted the webinar on inquiries amidst pandemic. We had sexual connotation, harassment and discrimination that was covered. And in March 2021, we had Mrs. Vijay Hari, who did a webinar on tricky cases handled by internal committee. We also had a webinar on PoSH Act versus IPC, because there is an overlap in several situations where we will have PoSH Act and the IPC getting involved together. So it's very important that the IC members understand this. Then in July 2021, which was last month, we had Dr. Sandhya Advani covering all the steps of post-inquiry. So the inquiry is completed. So what follows the inquiry? Even the inquiry report template was also shared with the with our subscribers. So it made it very easy for, and many of the subscribers appreciated that. And we also had PoSH case laws, where we took the IC members through different cases of PoSH. And in fact, one of our participants today asked, where can I find that? Because that's a common requirement for many IC members. So we took the IC members through some important PoSH case laws and judgments, right? So with this, we have come to the end of this section. So let's have a quick look at the Q&A. I think there are a few questions here. Can the respondent also be recommended by the ICC to go on leave during the pendency of inquiry? Yes, it depends. If the situation demands that the respondent might interfere in the inquiry by either threatening the complainant or the witnesses, yes, they can be recommended to go on leave. They can be transferred, right? So these are all within the powers of the internal committee. Do we have a recording or link to these webinars? Yes, of course, the webinar is recorded. You can go and give your details from the contact us page in our website, and we will be able to share them with you. How do we differentiate between domestic violence and sexual harassment from work from home, which is an extension of your workplace? Okay, domestic violence. See, as far as PoSH Act is concerned, it is talking about acts of sexual harassment between two employees. So if the act of sexual harassment happens as a part of the employment engagement, right, and it happens between the employees as part of the employment engagement, then it is an act of sexual harassment. However, the domestic violence, it can be between two family members. Of course, if the two family members are employees and it occurs, the act itself occurs as a part of an employment, then obviously it will fall under the ambit of PoSH Act. Yeah.
So just to add a couple of points, if it's got to be sexual harassment, there are certain elements that should be evidenced in that, like sexual connotation, right? That's one of the modules that we cover in our IC. So a domestic violence, if it's happened with a sexual connotation, and it is a place arising out of work, not just because it's work from home, but that engagement or the relationship is arising out of work, then definitely, yes, it can be considered as sexual harassment if both are employees or it's going to affect our workplace. Let me give you a couple of scenarios here. If, say, husband and wife both are employed in the organization, there's already a conflict if in case that's going to affect work if they are in the same department. If it's not in the same department, then this must be dealt with using the IPC and not through the PoSH Act within the workplace, right? And domestic violence, if it is with sexual connotation, and if it is because both of them are employed, and if it's going to affect future work of the employees with the organization, then IC can interfere. But in most situations, with so many ifs in this, it would ideally be handled by separate law. There are enough and more laws in terms of domestic violences. I think it would be handled by the IPC, that is, your police should handle the case of domestic violence, and there are also other NGOs which can support that. So it must be handled through that. So, but PoSH law, there are ways to differentiate other acts with sexual harassment through the lens of sexual connotation, and I think domestic violence would not qualify for that. So I'll proceed with the other two questions as well. Is the PoSH law different in India and in other countries like UK? Of course, it's different, because in India, I should say there are quite a few differences. PoSH law is not gender neutral. Here it's still, I should say, in a primitive stage where we're only protecting the majority of the violences. Of course, women are the ones who are mostly affected, but there are also other genders, like that's not considered by the PoSH law. While in UK, the act is based on Equality Act of 2010, which is protected, which provides protection against 9 different protected characteristics, where gender is only one of them, and in that, sexual harassment is only one of them. So there are several other protected characteristics which are covered by the UK law. If you compare the other countries which has sexual harassment related laws, then you would find that US is a lot more closer to that. But even there are 9 states which have come up with sexual harassment related laws. The first one to come up was California, and then New York, Maine, Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois. A lot of these states have also come up with sexual harassment laws, right? So, but in all of these states, sexual harassment is protected against protection is provided to all genders, not just one gender. But if you look at it in India, it is only for women employees and only for women, not employees. I should say it's only for women. So that way, there's still some more distance to cover, but now it's just now LGBTQ and all of that is getting recognized. So hopefully in the future, when it's getting amended, it would move out of Women and Child Development Department and move to the Human Resources Department and have all of these sections covered as well, right? And also bystander intervention is not directly provided by the PoSH law, but if you look at it in most of the other countries, progressive laws are already there where it need not be just the complainant who will have to complain. Anyone who is witnessing or anyone who is a bystander can also interfere, complain, or even protect that person. So that way, if you look at it, there's still some more to be done on the PoSH law, but it's completely different from what we have in the other countries. But end of the day, it's the law of the land. If your organization is in India, you have to abide by that and at least provide the minimum requirements of the PoSH law. If you can provide for the extended requirements mandated by the other laws, it's more than welcome, right? Okay, so there's a question on pricing. How expensive is it? Is the entire structuring and awareness? Harita, probably that we will take up later. We just wanted to provide the details of what's provided by the organization, but we'll definitely handle that separately. We'll reach out to you on that, right? Okay, so with that said, let me just share my screen again. Okay, so thanks, Jelani, for the session on IC capacity building. Let me move on to the last compliance requirement out of the 5. I know we are kind of pretty tight on the timeline, but we'll try to complete this as fast as we can. There are 2 requirements in terms of annual report. The first report is to the district officer identified by the respective state governments, the Women and Child Development Department of the respective state governments. And the second report is to the ROC, that is Registrar of Companies or the shareholders, right? So the chapters and the respective clause like section 20 and 21, it's listed on the right side, where section 20 is for the district officer's report, 21 is for the ROC report. Okay, so let's look at the report to the district officer. The reporting period is from Jan 1st to December 31st. It's not December 1st. It's December 31st, 2021. If in case the year is this year, it's 2021, then it's from Jan to December end. And the submission period is recommended to be 1st Jan to 31st Jan of the next year. So if you're trying to submit a report to the district officer from Jan 1st to December 31st of 2021, the current year, then you'll have to do it during the first month of the next year. And this must be submitted to the district officer. Here are the details that I mentioned, very basic details, no specific details about the case. It's more about the number of sexual harassment complaints filed in the year, number of complaints disposed of, and how many are pending disposal beyond the 90-day period, and the nature of actions taken. In some cases, in some district officer cases, particularly in Mumbai, they ask for more details. But otherwise, these are the details required. As a part of this, you are also required to provide the number of workshops or awareness programs that were conducted by the employer to increase awareness about sexual harassment at workplace. So this is something that you have to do, submit as a report to the district officer. The usual process is the IC would actually submit it to the district officer, or the IC would submit it to the employer and have a copy to the district officer, or the employer forwards that report to the district officer. You can follow one of these methods, but it has to be submitted to the district officer during the first month. And usually there is no strict timeline on the end date, but usual practices during the first month of the next calendar year, right? The next report is director's report to the shareholder. This is for the period from 1st of April to 31st of March in the next year, right? 1st of April 2021 to 31st of March in the year 2022. That's considered as a financial year. And director's report is always for a financial year. So the usual practice is the director's report would be released during the month of September, or if in case of public companies, sometimes even earlier than that. But usual deadline is by 30th of September. And most times it also gets extended. So consider that as well, right? But the details that needs to be mentioned is that the organization is compliant with the PoSH law, that you have a policy and all of those details, and the number of cases handled, number of cases disposed of, and if in case there are cases beyond 90 days, you need to actually mention that as well. So this is something that usually the company secretary would take care of for a private limited company or a public listed company. This is not a requirement for other organizations like institutions, NGOs, or partnership firms and all that. This is only for private limited companies and public limited companies where they have to publish a director's report to the shareholder through the registrar of companies, right? So that's something that you need to take care of. These are the 2 reports that you'll have to do. And how can eLearnPOSH help with this report? So we have 3 methods by which we do. We provide a comprehensive e-learning on how to prepare these reports. We provide all the templates required, and we also provide the contact points. Let me just switch to that section where this is part of our e-learning course, which we have. So identifying the district officer in your district would be very difficult. So what we provide is wherever the Ministry of Women and Child Development, whenever they disclose that information, like who's the director, who's the district officer in your district, we collect that detail and we put it as a part of this course. This course gets updated every year at the time when you have to submit the report to the district officer. You will be able to select the state, and then once you select, you will have the districts where we have the information. You can go to that district and you will have the detail where you need to submit this report to, right? So you can actually go to that person, and we also provide the information where we got it from. So you will be able to verify that from there, right? So this is something that we provide for all the districts, and wherever there is detail, we collect that and we update it, and we do our best to collect as much as possible, but there is still a little compliance that can help from even the government, so that if they can publish it in an online environment, it's easier for us to do it. Otherwise, we try to do an email campaign, send it to the respective secretaries in the department and try to gather the details as well. This is also available as a part of our IC course, where you can actually do that. You can get the details and submit your reports. As a part of this course, we also provide the covering letter template and the annual report template, which can be used to create your annual report, which can be submitted to the district offices, right? And the entire training on what information to be provided, how it is to be provided, everything is shared in this e-learning course, which is about 15 to 20 minutes, but it's quite comprehensive that way. Apart from that, at the end of the year, when you complete a calendar year with eLearnPOSH's courses, you will also get a organizational training compliance letter, which can help feed some data into your report, in your annual report, where we provide that to organizations who are part of our training for the year. We also provide a report that you have trained this many people during the year. These are the sessions that you've conducted. These are the webinars that you conducted, and you've made all of this. This is digitally signed document that will be provided to every organization who's empaneled or who's subscribed to our programs, any of the 3 programs, employer, manager, or IC, right? So this is how we help organizations comply with the law. So that covers the 5 topics. But in addition to that, in case of an inquiry, there's also another compliance requirement. This is only if you have a case. The other ones are whether you have a case or not, you have to comply with these 5 elements. But if you have a case, then you have to comply with the timeline and the procedure as well. So here, as I mentioned, it must be received and handled within the 3-month period from the time the last act of sexual harassment happened, and the complaint must be received, and within 7 working days, it must be sent to the respondent, and the respondent has to reply within 10 working days. And IC must have an inquiry or go for a conciliation if in case the complainant opts for it. And then this must be completed within a period of 90 days, and within 10 days from that completion of inquiry, then IC has to provide a recommendation to the employer to take action. And of course, the employer has 60 days by which they have to take that action. So all of these timelines should also be complied with. But this is only if you have a case. But whether you have a case or not, if you have more than 10 employees, you will have to comply with the other 5 provisions. If you have less than 10 employees, then the provisions is practicality is also considered by the law, where it is automatically handled by the local complaints committee. So the district officer is responsible for forming that committee, and they will act as an internal committee for your organization until such time where you form a committee or you reach a point where you have to form a committee. So the district officer will handle all of that. If there is a complaint against the employer, that is, if the complaint is against any of the directors of the organization, then it is directly flowing to the district, the local complaints committee, which is handled by the, which is created or constituted by the district officer. So it is not something that the IC should handle. If there is a complaint against, say, the founder or the CEO or anyone at a senior level who's also part of the board, who's considered as an employer, then that should not be handled by the IC. That should be handled by the local complaints committee, right? So I know we are on the top of the hour, probably a couple of minutes more than that. So if there are any questions, we can handle that. So there's also another question on the cost and start date. So Ashi will reach out to you separately. There is no start date. As it's e-learning, we can start anytime during the year. It need not be just during a particular month or date. As it's e-learning, it's fairly flexible. We can start. The end date, of course, for any training during a calendar year should be by 31st of December, because you need to report all of that by the month of Jan in the next year to the district officer. So that's something that you need to consider. Start date can be anything. Okay, there are a few questions. Let me just quickly go through that. Can a person lodge a complaint to district officer where even though constitution of committee was mandatory, an organization haven't constituted one? So yes, of course, they can go to the district officer, but the district officer would, of course, refer the person back to the organization to structure and form the committee, right? So that has happened several times. So it's something that will happen, but it is the responsibility of the organization to form that committee. And if they go to the IPC and even if they go to the police would also ask, like, why don't you contact the internal complaints committee or internal committee to take this complaint forward? Because it's going to increase their crime rate. Police usually would refer them back to the internal committee if in case that's available. If nothing is available, of course, it's non-compliance for the organization. So the district officer may handle it if there is no other option or if it's against the employer, but it's definitely non-compliance and it can be penalized as well. So there is a question, if there are no complaints during, are we still required to file the details with ROC? So all of the 5 points that we mentioned at the top, like policy drafting, IC constitution awareness, IC capacity building, or annual reporting, whether you have a complaint or not, you have to do all of this. There is no choice left in that topic. The inquiry part of it, where you have to meet a timeline, that will apply only if you have an inquiry. So even if you have 0 cases, in fact, our organization did not have a case, fortunately, but we still file that annual report every year and we release it as a part of our director report as well. So that's something that's mandatory. There is not much choice there. Okay, so are there any more questions? Are there any questions on chat? Okay, there are a couple of positive ones. Share this recording. Yes, definitely we will share this recording with all the participants. We will also get the email probably once we put that on YouTube. We will share the email with the link, and we'll also provide you a gift voucher that will be a discount voucher if in case you want to consider eLearnPOSH for your PoSH Compliance Solutions. We will not be sharing the PowerPoint presentation, but the entire recording of the video will be definitely shared. Okay, in one incident, the complainant accused of being partial against the chairperson of the IC, and the chairperson stepped down and a new person was named as the IC chairperson. Okay, that's, I think, for one of the questions there. I think, can HR be part of it? That's answered. Of late, there are many false complaints due to settled scores. I'm sorry, I just jumped. Settled scores, official or person conflicts, workplace. This is a big threat to actual complaints. The law also provides provision for action against false complaints, but the only catch here is just because they are not able to provide evidence doesn't mean that it's false complaint. It's also the responsibility of the IC to identify without any doubt that this was a false complaint, either an evidence was fudged or it was done with the motive to just affect another person. If they can prove that, they can take action against the person who's complained as well. The law provides that as well. Okay, I think that's all the questions. If there are any questions, please do put them on the Q&A panel. We'll be more than happy to answer that. Otherwise, we will contact you over email with the recording and the discount voucher as well for participating in this, if in case you want to consider eLearnPOSH. Hope you found value in this session, like you do in every other eLearnPOSH webinar sessions. And if there are any feedbacks or complaints or concerns, or if there is any inaccuracy in what we share, please do write to us and we'll look into it. Right? Thanks a lot, team. Thanks for joining us. Looking forward to the next time.